Thomas Reuter, welcome to our podcast and videocast and our program. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana, for inviting me.
So you and I are both fellows in the World Academy of Art and Science and care deeply about the future and creating, ensuring the future of life. Now in the post-COVID world, we both agree that the importance of changing existing systems and financing that change is extremely important. So from your perspective, what are the most important acupuncture points that would help us achieve that goal?
Well, I think what seems to me an important gap is that, you have investors basically investing in order to maximize profits. A lot of fund managers will tell you that it's their fiduciary duty to do so. So there is this sort of profit motive, and there's a lot of pressure to maximize profit. Okay. On the other hand, if you look at people trying to maximize benefit, it's a kind of a in some ways it becomes a fear response. You think you only need to think about the hoarding of toilet paper during the COVID crisis. You know, these kind of insane obsession with hoarding material resources. Now, I think for most people, their savings, their investments, it's their security, and they chase the highest possible profits because they don't know what will be tomorrow. Tomorrow could be nothing or a loss. So while you can, you try and get as much out of it as you can, and I think that's the core of the problem, and it could be overcome by providing other opportunities for investment that are not quite as profitable but more secure. I mean, that's normal. It's normal that you can opt for more secure investments and in exchange for a lower return. But at the moment, there's a real lack of those kinds of options. If you look at bank deposits or term deposits, bonds, and other so-called secure investments, in diversified credit, and so on, we'll see that the returns are extremely small, often below inflation. And that means that for a lot of people, that's not an option. And so they get pushed into the share market, and we get these sort of phenomena where the share market is exploding, even though the Main Street economy is imploding, like the last few months. Because there's just all this money floating around, not knowing where to go. And I think what we need is investment options that support sustainable transformation to a sustainable society, that give a modest return, nothing excessive, maybe, I don't know, 4%, 5%, most people would be happy with that. Certainly 4% above inflation, let's say. Most people would be very happy with that if they could have a secure investment at that level. So I think that there's an opportunity there to create green bonds that do pay that kind of return and support innovative investment in a transformation. So that's one opportunity I see.
Right. So from your perspective, also, if you were to consult with the European Union, for instance, given the fact that they are really deeply involved in seeking solutions right now, what would you recommend them to do? What kind of economic model, for instance, would you recommend they adopt?
Well, it's a matter of political will and commitment, and it's interesting, those noises that are now coming from the EU Commission, from van der Leyen and her allies, in the European Central Bank, and also Angela Merkel recently has kind of been making some noises, Macron, of course. And there's talk of a Green New Deal. I mean, it all, of course, matters very much what that means in practice. So that remains to be spelled out to some extent. And there may be some pushback from certain interest groups. It's already happening, as far as I know, a fair bit of pushback. But I think there's a good opportunity, and Europe is a model, you know, for the world in many ways, because there's a certain commitment by the elite, yeah, to maintain a reasonably balanced economy, meaning, you know, limiting inequality and you know, social maintaining social benefits for the population and so on, you know, like you know, harkening back to the New Deal idea of Roosevelt. So I think those are, you know, positive signs. You know, there's some will, obviously, to try and stop this process of polarization, you know, politically, that comes inevitably with a economic polarization, where you have large parts of the society missing out and becoming poorer rather than better off. And I think it's not so much the poor as the middle class that's descending. You know, the part of the middle class that is descending in the US, for example, you know, very, very clear. If you look at the work of Elizabeth Warren, long before she became a senator, I was reading her work on the middle class, which I thought was fantastic. And really, I mean, an eye-opener, you know, the fact that the middle class in 1970 in the US had a comparable living standard on one income, meaning one partner could stay at home and care for children. So on one wage, they had about as much disposable income as people now have on two wages, or, you know, often working 2 or 3 jobs. So it's really, you know, that something fundamental has shifted there, and people cannot help but notice that change, and they're concerned of losing their privileges and their living standards. So there's a backlash, a political polarization. I think in Europe, the penny has dropped, you know, that you cannot continue in that direction without having, you know, massive instability. Yeah. So I think that's good. And what would I advise? That's difficult. Obviously, it's complex. You know, what we need is system change. We need a transformation at a systemic level. There are different main areas. They are all interlinked. The interactions are sometimes negative, sometimes positive. So you may, you know, for example, you may allocate some land to growing biofuels, but you may encroach on forests, so you're destroying biodiversity. Or if you don't do that, you encroach on agricultural land, you undermine food security. You may be using too much water. You know, the forest you cut down may release huge amounts of carbon, you know, greater than you can ever hope to make up with those biofuels, and so on and so forth. It's all interconnected, all the different SDGs or whatever model you use to describe the systemic whole. The different parts are connected. It is a whole, so it's very difficult to have simplistic advice. You know, it doesn't really lend itself to simplistic advice. You have to have the whole system in view all the time and understand the main factors. I think the SDG are a good guide, but there are other models around. Yes.
Right. So you focused on our current economic system that is basically debt driven. It's based on quantitative easing. We keep printing money. Ever since the financial crisis started, we printing money, throwing it to bankrupt systems like, banks at the time, and creating inequality that has risen, that you refer to, and that Elizabeth Warren referred to. So this is, on one hand, it's a system that has to push growth, print more money to support growth, otherwise it would collapse. And the downside, of course, is that it creates the inequality, as we said, and we are borrowing from the future, expecting our children and their children to pay for it. At the same time, we have another phenomenon that is arising that is not inflationary, it's deflationary, and that is exponential growth, technological exponential growth that rides on an exponential curve that is now disrupting all of our systems, because that are more or less have been digitalized. So on one hand, we have the deflation, and on the other, we have the inflation. Deflation created through technology that makes everything cheaper and more compact, and yet is driving us. And we see how COVID-19 has brought us to the forefront, and we're using now these technological developments in order to communicate, to still stay in touch. How do you see these being reconciled with one another?
Well,
do you see that anybody is addressing this? There's a huge split, and at the same time, of course, is something that you brought up, is the grand global challenges, from climate change to unsafe AI, for example, or unsafe biotechnology or nuclear threat.
Well, that's the thing, inequality is really the key issue, rising inequality. I mean, let's be honest, a perfectly equal society has never existed, and I will never see one exist in my lifetime. And if in the distant future that should ever come to pass, good luck, but I'm not going to wait for that. Inequality is probably to some degree unavoidable, to some degree perhaps also okay. Some people are willing to work harder than others. Some people have more talents, moderate degree of incentive for people like that might be okay. I don't have a problem with that. But we have massive inequality, and the consequence is that you have these financial interventions, by the central banks, the money printing. You were talking about quantitative easing, but look at the inflation rate. It's not going up. It's flatlining, and it's flatlining because that money flows into asset bubbles. It doesn't flow into prices, or because it doesn't go to the consumers. So it goes straight into asset bubbles. It props up the stock market, not the real economy. And that's, a lot of people have been, critical about, for example, the most recent wave of economic stimulus, and that it hasn't properly found its way into the real economy, that it isn't really driving innovation so much, that cuts are made in education, and so on. So the money's not really flowing where it should go. Otherwise, we would have inflation. Okay, so it's a clear sign that the stimulus is flowing into an unequal system, and it just plods the asset bubbles that are already there, whether it's housing, whether it's share markets, and those who missed out on that. So the ones who are in that, who are shareholders, significant shareholders, or real estate owners, their boats are lifted by the tide, but everybody else is left behind. And the consequence is that you have unaffordable housing now in many cities. In Munich, where you live, for example, classic case, Berlin is starting like that, Frankfurt in Germany, places like Paris, London, a lot of major cities and also medium cities are now becoming unaffordable for people because there's this disconnect, and it's all comes from an attitude of not caring about who the economy really should serve, and that is the people. Yeah. The economy should serve the people, not the other way around. And it shouldn't serve just a small minority. And while you can have some inequality, you might have entrepreneurs. My own family were a family of entrepreneurs, and I'm sort of a bit odd, having become an academic, though a somewhat entrepreneurial academic. I've spent most of my time on project money and fellowships and external money, and not really dependent on the academic system. So I've approached entrepreneurial, and I'm not opposed to that. I have great respect for entrepreneurs. But the thing is, you have to, if it's just profit motive, and if it's just extracting resources from the social capital that is there, the society, from the natural capital, from the ecosystem, it's just about extracting, then it's not really proper entrepreneurship, because an entrepreneur is someone, to my mind, who wants to distinguish him or herself by leading and by generating employment and creating something new products, new services that are beneficial. And they get their satisfaction from that success, from the creative act itself, not so much the money. That shouldn't be central. If that's central, then it's to me, it's kind of like a form of entrepreneurship that's predatorial. It's not social, it's not moral. So I guess what I was saying earlier, in Europe, I think there's still signs that the money elite and the industrial elite has some sort of sense of obligation, certainly to a greater extent than, say, in the US or the UK even. We've seen with COVID, how that attitude plays out in the number of casualties, that different countries suffer and the number of infections. You can clearly see, there are differences in the level of care for the population. And it's not perfect anywhere. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all the problems that we have in Europe also, with housing bubbles and with political polarizations and the emergence of populist ideologies and so on. So we have the problem, but it's not as extreme, and it matters. Those differences really matter for people. The outcomes are very different. So, but it could be improved in Europe too, and yeah.
So what would you recommend? What kind of policy interventions would you recommend be enacted upon? How would you change the measurement criteria, for instance? How would you suggest moving from for-profit only as a measurement criterion to multiple bottom lines, for example? What would have to happen? What kind of legislation would have to occur in order to implement that from your point of view?
Well, it's there are many ways of looking at that. Ultimately, it's about values. What do we value? We design an economic system for what purpose? And the purpose is defined by our values. If we value a fair society where inequality is moderate, okay, where people have opportunities, people have access to good education. We both are good examples of what access to good education can do. And what a loss for the world if people with potential aren't giving those opportunities. It's crazy. I mean, if I look at some of the policies that operate in Australia, also the UK, I've spent a lot of time in English-speaking countries. I understand them quite well. And I look at the German system, I think that, well, Germany's been smart, not kind, but smart in investing in public education. And they had a brief moment when they thought, well, fees for university courses, maybe we should experiment with that, but they drew back. They were smart enough to stop those experiments because the success of Germany as a nation is built on having a highly educated workforce. It's our biggest assets. We don't have oil reserves. We don't have a vast amount of other natural resources. We are a small, highly populated country. Our resources, people. And to leave that to a private system like in Australia, where, you know, you send your child to high school, you know, it's like 25,000 Australian dollars a year. Then you go to university and it continues, you know. So it's a system designed for destroying certainly the lower middle class, okay, or impoverishing them, you know, indebting them. Look at the, you know, the educational debt level in the US also, you know. So it's, you know, I think the spending has to be wise, and it has to think about outcomes and what are desirable outcomes. And ideally, I mean, in a democracy, this should be negotiated. There needs to be public debate. You can't dictate. No one has a right to dictate what should be the aim. It should be, there should be public debate and a consensus. Okay, and then funds are allocated accordingly in education, in health. Look at the American health system. You have the most expensive health system in the world, largely private, and it's not delivering. It's delivering for a few, no doubt, you know. For a few it works okay, but by and large, as a whole, it doesn't really work. So I think public education, public health is very important. I also think certain industries should be more regulated, maybe broken up. Some of the tech giants, because these are public goods, like search engines. There's nothing much to it, really. I mean, it should be basically common property or public good to have those facilities. Yeah, it shouldn't be really private. These are natural cartels. Many industries are natural cartels. So you end up with a situation that's anti-capitalist. You have a cartel. That's poison to a genuine capitalist system which thrives on competition. But if you have a cartel, then it's not really capitalist anymore. It's I don't know, what do you want to call it? I mean, it's a cartel, and they should be either you know, in public ownership or broken up. Probably in public. It depends on the case. Yeah. So those are some important aspects. But yeah, I think system change is important, systemic thinking, and because action for sustainability is always ultimately local, it's got to happen in some place. It's not utopian, meaning no place, it's some place. Okay, otherwise it'll be always utopia. It has to, utopia meaning place. It has to be in place. And one of the problems is, a structural problem is that the local governments, certainly in Germany, but in many places, are starved of funds. They don't have access to a large enough proportion of overall government revenue to actually do the changes. And even with those limited resources, they're doing quite a lot. In fact, everything that is being done, they are doing it. So allocating more funds at lower tiers of government and also supporting community activities, funding community activities would be very good, because if they are funded and communities become more actively involved, people hear about it, they join in, and you know, you create change by directing funding to those local activities. Also local businesses, by the way. Yeah, small businesses employ a lot of people, produce a lot of economic output. Incidentally, also small farmers, like small farmers worldwide on a third of their land produce the vast majority of the food we eat. And the remaining food that's produced industrially is mainly sugar and fat, meaning, corn syrup, things like that, canola oil, things we could really do without, okay? So, you know what I mean? Small is beautiful. I really like that, that motto, which goes back to E.F. Schumacher's economic theory. And yeah, so not too top heavy, sort of pay more attention at the local level, I mean, in designing new economic models. So that's it doesn't mean you don't have cooperation. I'm very much in favor of the EU and other multilateral forms of cooperation. We need that. But it still has to happen locally, and every place is different. Every community has a different culture, different history, different resources, different population density, everything, completely different parameters. So you have common goals, but you each have to find each place, each community has to find their own way to realize those goals. So, yeah.
I couldn't agree more. So from your perspective, how do you think could we manage to get the funds that are currently being printed, the dollars, the euros, to the organizations that you mentioned, the farmers, the entrepreneurs? Currently, there's a hard, difficult way, and we know that the quantitative easing of the past decade didn't quite reach those who needed it because of the ways we de-risk. So that didn't work, at least not at scale. And now we need to scale that investment process in that decision for screening. So what are your ideas around that?
Yes, how do you allocate the funds? That's a good question. Yeah, that's not an easy question, because you see, in bureaucracies, the allocation of funds to large pools is a lot easier than allocating it to 1 million different places. So there's always this tendency to pile more on the piles that are already there. Look at the bailouts. It's about saving the big companies. In Germany, the car industry, Lufthansa, and so on. It's not so much. There's not so much. It's much harder to support small businesses unless you decentralize it. You see, unless you decentralize the process. If they'd, for example, said, okay, well, half of all the funds will be distributed to local governments to support their local businesses, then for them, the question, who are the big fish, in our place, in our jurisdiction, they would be relatively small fish on the national scale in most cases. They'd be medium-sized companies, smaller companies that are very important where they are. And to those governments, it'd be easy to do. They can immediately tell you what are the 10 biggest employers in our jurisdiction from tax revenue that they get. They know what's important for their local economy. So if you task them with distributing some of these funds with good criteria, that would have been better. So I guess part of it is about involving lower tiers of government in the distribution of funds rather than only looking at the national level. So that way you can be much more, targeted. And the other thing is innovation. I mean, we're still, globally and in many nations subsidizing fossil fuels massively, huge sums that would be enough to realize the SDGs to a large extent. The other thing is defense. I just read today Australia announced a 50% increase in its defense spending over the next 10 years. Okay, we appear to have no other problems other than defense. Okay, if you ask them, well, what about sustainable development, renewable energy, or how about gas? How about gas or coal? Which is they have actually a national COVID commission, COVID reconstruction commission that was headed by people, lobbyists from the coal and gas industry. So what do you expect? So that's another major problem. I mean, you can't change the economy if it's not in our hands. If the system is captured, if the political elites are captive to the moneyed elites, then they're not going to be leading that process. So I really think also it's really time for the moneyed elites to wake up to their responsibility if they want to control everything. It's just like, you're in the car with somebody, okay, and you don't like the way they're driving, okay, so you kind of oust them. They're the driver, but you push them out of their seat and you take the wheel, okay, from the passenger seat. Well, if you want to take the wheel, you better know where you're going. You better know how to do it, okay. So I feel that there's a real a lot of pressure now on those people to wake up to their responsibility, which they don't have officially, but unofficially, they do have that responsibility because they actually control and not the democratic elected representatives who are dependent on them for their, election campaign funds and so on and so forth. So yeah, so it's a matter of responsibility, taking responsibility, accepting responsibility. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that the small and medium enterprises play a decisive role in changing the economy and participating to it. And the numbers are quite clear. It's 90% of all businesses are small and medium enterprises. 50% of employment is, and 55% of the GDP minimum worldwide comes from small and medium enterprises. How do you see their role changing right now? Because from my personal experience over the past 30 years as a serial entrepreneur and investor, the small entrepreneurs do get it. They are so close to the ground. They don't care about financial sustainability. They do care about making their idea work, and they do care about their values. So how do you see them participate in this transformation right now?
Well, obviously they're operating in numerous different fields. I know you are very much interested in IT and AI fields and all that. How will they contribute? Yeah, well, it's difficult to say. I think obviously there'll be a new ways to produce energy sustainably, new ways of dealing with waste to replace plastics, for example. There's so many areas where innovative small companies are making a mark. plastics is a good example. You know, there are now many experiments with different ways of recycling using biological processes, for example. There's so much going on, also developing plastics that are from the production and already designed to be basically edible, yeah, to at least to bacteria. Okay, so there's a lot to be done there, also with energy, you know, hydrogen fuel, so fuel cells, battery technology. There's so much there that needs to be done, and often, you know, the creative ideas don't happen in the center of things, but at the margins. Okay, it's always the living. You know, look at the cell, for example. It's the cell wall where the election is. Yeah, everything else is kind of business as usual. But at the boundary, there's innovation. There's new things. So these people are the boundary because they're not well-established firms. They're not secure. You know, they don't have a scam happening whereby they extract millions of dollars every day doing nothing. They actually have to do things to make money. They have to actually deliver, not just appropriate, but above the call of duty. They have to be exceptional to succeed. You know, because there really is competition. They have to be really outstanding, their products, their ideas, and that's why they are. Yeah. So I think they'll make a huge contribution, and they could be supported. I mean, there are, of course, government schemes to help startups. You know, for example, Swiss in Switzerland, you know, very big operation. I think it's helpful, but more could be done there. And also, it's very difficult for investors, certainly retail investors. I shouldn't tell you this because you know 100 times more about that. But for retail investors, it's very difficult to access that kind of venture capital market, and it's high risk. But if you have good evaluation processes, which you do, then you can minimize risk and you can spread it. You know, you can bundle it, and I think a lot of people would be interested in putting their money there rather than somewhere else. Yeah, as I said, you know, if say you could have a government-backed fund for small enterprises, so that's got some kind of backup security, maybe from government, and a modest gain, and from that fund that comes from investors who, you know, you could finance those enterprises. You know, by all means, screen them somehow, have a screening process, but make more funding available to that part of the economy. Yeah, so they can tap into it. They don't have to, you know, convince so conservative investors or banks. Sometimes the risk can be too high in individual projects, but overall, if there are ways to spread that risk that would help attract more investment there.
Right. So one of the de-risking criteria is contained in the measurements, the metrics by which we measure success. And sure. So you spoke about investing with your values, or building companies with your values, or being a politician that appreciates value. We can only achieve what we measure. So from your perspective, how would our measurement criteria for success would have to change in order to bring those values into the overall way of measuring our future?
Yeah, I think it's about externalities. You know, it's to a large extent we've been measuring companies in very simplistic terms, and the amount of profit they generate relative to their level of capitalization, and that's not enough. And we have a regulatory environment where they can operate like that. They have limited liability. They don't pay for environmental damage. They don't pay for social damage, for not paying their employees enough, for example. For example, just an anecdotal little tidbit of information from Australia recently. There were steps taken to actually criminalize wage theft. Now, wage theft is if there's there's an award in a particular industry and you don't pay people at the award rate. So that's theft. It's theft. Until now, nobody has ever gone to jail for that kind of stealing. Now, if you steal a book or a piece of cheese in a shop, you might go to jail, if you keep doing that. But there you can just, no problem. You can steal from your labor force. It's okay, that kind of thing. So I guess there should be criteria that reflect how a company deals with all its stakeholders, its customers, its employees, its investors, not just the investors. Okay, then basically that's a company that does all that well is a well-managed company, and it's likely to be very stable, have good commitment from its workforce. Its workforce is probably likely to be slightly less neurotic and scared and hateful towards each other, more cooperative. People, if you really push people, they become unable to cooperate. The trust level drops. You have this sort of unhealthy situations, where everybody's scrambling, fighting for survival. That's not how you get the best out of people. So generally, it's not just feel good, but it's about healthy. It's not just feeling good, but being healthy as a company in a very broad sense. Then you serve the society, the broader society. And I think such companies tend to be also profitable. And I think, some of the experience from SRI, socially responsible in investment or similar metrics, these are all different measurement schemes. How do you define SRI, or other sustainable investment concepts? They all kind of ultimately come down to metrics. And it turns out that portfolios that use those metrics, or companies that score high on those metrics, have done very well indeed, because they're quite healthy companies in that broader sense. So it's not bad for investment. It's not feel good, healthy. Actually, it also means strong performance. And
yeah, which in my case, I can attest to the fact that actually the financial bottom line is way much more successful than if you add that to the way of building a company, running a company, and so on, than if you don't. So the financial bottom line is much more successful, which brings us to the other topic of today's conversation, mind shift. So how can we achieve mind shift at larger scale? I mean, and you're an expert in that. You've spent decades in your life becoming healthy, as you call it. Can you share with us your secrets? What are the top acupuncture points of a healthy mind shift?
Well, I think, I'm I'm, you know, in my professional capacity, I'm a scientist. I'm a social scientist, a professor, an academic, you know, all that. So science to me is very important. But
Psychology is also science. It's not widely accepted, but
I
psychology
studied
is
psychology for
important.
3 years, and I've, you know, I've spent decades reading psychology. So I'm a kind of an honorary psychologist as well, somewhere, but mainly an anthropologist, which is another long story to explain that. Most people don't know what that means, but never mind.
Our
What I
listeners
was
do.
trying to say really is that, you know, I'm very much supportive of science and evidence and reason. But there's more to it than being cold, calculating, intellectual. That's a misconception. Or it's sort of a limited point of view or perspective on knowledge. And it's I think at the heart of many of the problems that we experience. For one, if you look at theorists like Jürgen Habermas and so on, you know, Bertrand Russell and many other philosophers, you realize that you cannot have reason, you cannot have science if you don't have democracy. If you silence people, okay, if you don't let people participate, you're not going to have the truth or the whole truth if you exclude. Truth is about inclusion, because the truth is not absolute. It's as good as our ability to pool our mental capacity, our collective mind is as good as the inclusiveness or the level of inclusiveness in our societies. So democracy and science, to me, are inseparable. Okay, of course you can have a sort of reductionist science. You can have a totalitarian society, and you have nuclear scientists there to develop a bomb for your glorious leader and all that sort of thing. But that's not science the way I understand it. That's kind of a science that has become enslaved. That's become totally instrumentalized. And that's what's happened since the Enlightenment period, or the Renaissance, when we had this return to, you know, turn away from ideology, largely religious, to truth finding, you know, establishing the truth, you know, in a way, through openness, through empirical investigation, through sharing knowledge, through inclusion. Okay, that was the idea. And the idea was also that it would, you know, it was a kind of also a spiritual quest. It wasn't called enlightenment for nothing, you know. This was about, you know, it was a period of humanism. Yeah, it was about human beings reaching their full potential. But then you had this instrumentalization happening. So you had all this idea, all this knowledge, and the power that goes with it. You know, if you read Michel Foucault, you know that knowledge is also power. Then, you know, it became instrumentalized. It became subjugated to lower interests, materialist interests. And the problem is that science itself, because of the way it emerged as a critique of religion, yeah, very much justified critique, but it has a sort of a hangover there, a sort of a habitual negation of anything religious. And I mean by religious, the big questions. It shies away from the big questions, but we can't, you know, we can't shy away from the big questions. If we do, then we become materialist. Yeah, we sort of say, well, you know, okay, to begin with, we are nothing but apes. Okay, we're a bunch of apes. We are nothing but mortal beings. Okay, and we are only this and only that. It's always all these tyranny of onlys. You know, it's scientific reductionism. It's only this. You know, but it's a very a negative perspective on life. This kind of reductionist materialism. It's not real science to me. It's a kind of a bitter life-denying kind of science. And the real science to me is about exploration, discovery, wonder, and indeed awe at the magnificent complexity of the world and indeed ourselves. And so we need to find that. We need to stop reducing everything to material benefits and material status, wealth. And these things are meaningless to a being that's only around for a few years. It's a complete nonsense. It's a complete distraction. Of course, we need to eat, we need to have shelter, we need clothing, but look at the COVID crisis. It's showing us how little we really need. What do we really need when push comes to shove? Very little materially. But the other needs are enormous. Our social needs, our need for acceptance, for a friendship, for love, for community. Those are the things that really matter. We should remind ourselves. And then we can talk about economy, and which is ultimately a system for allocating resources. So how do we do that to maximize our well-being, our potential for community, for individual growth, through education, and so on. So yeah, the real mind shift has to happen there somewhere, I think. Yeah.
And it's a lot of hard work.
Yeah, it is, but it's, I mean, I think, for myself, I've made that mind shift long ago, okay? But I don't feel that I gave up anything or I lost anything. Quite to the contrary, I feel much freer, much more fulfilled, much more whole, much more at home in the world than before. So why not do it,
Well, what happened? Would you like to share with us?
There's nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Nothing to lose.
What happened? We have 2 more minutes. So what happened in your life that helped you shift your previous mind to your current mind? And I'm sure it is a journey. It's not an end.
Oh, for me, it happened fairly early. I mean, as a teenager, I realized that I couldn't quite understand what all this rat race was about, the sort of compulsive concern that people had with certain ideas of success. And I was very critical of that from an early age. And I guess I embarked on reading, and I embarked on various ways of finding out, something about what life is really, what's really important in life. And everybody, I wouldn't ever tell other people what to hold important in life. It's really a process of asking the question. It's about the question, and gradually you feel that a lot of things are not so important. It's very liberating, and yeah, it's really our connection to other people that's primary, and therefore I think doing the right thing is not something, it's not about moralizing, but it's good for yourself, if whether you're a businessman or a politician or community leader or whoever you are, or doctor, it's about, contributing. It's about being part of something larger. That's how we derive our meaning and our fulfillment. And if you can build an economy on that principle, I think it would be very different. Yeah.
What a beautiful way to end our interview. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom, and for your willingness to share it with us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mariana.